welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And in our episode today, we are going to discuss the topic of the loss of skill or talent, or maybe even competitiveness at a certain level. And we're going to use an article from the Journal of the Philosophy of Sport as inspiration for this. The title of the article is Life Outside the Diamond is a Wrench on Experiencing Talent Loss in Sports. The authors are Catherine Robb, Alfred Archer, and Kenneth Agerholm. They all work at universities in Norway. And I found this interesting, Josh, because I think at some point in our tennis careers, we might sense that our level has dropped, or our ability to compete at a level has dropped, or a new level. And maybe that's a temporary thing, or maybe it's the way things are going to be going forward. So, how can we deal with that? The transition from playing at the top of your competitive powers to no longer being able to win matches you used to win can be a difficult thing to go through mentally and emotionally. And this particular article brings to light three ways of looking at this kind of level, I guess, performance level drop, or not as able to compete at a certain level. They call it talent, although I think in North America, the way we use the word talent, we wouldn't say that somebody's not talented anymore, but we might say they're maybe not competitive at this level anymore, right? So I think there's some terms we can use around that. But they look at this through three different lenses, because this is a philosophical journal for sport. And so there's what they call the essentialist lens, the social environmental lens, and then sort of the existential lens of things. And we're going to go over what those three types of views are on the idea of talent loss, or loss of ability to compete. And I think all of them really can play together. There's an interplay, and we can use some examples, and then we'll try to wrap with, okay, we're all going to go through some of this at some point. How can we prepare ourselves such that the transition to whatever's next in our tennis careers feels a little bit more smooth and is not as disorienting as it potentially could be? So before we get into our conversation, let's take a moment to just mention our sponsor, Go Sport. So as a listener of the Tennis IQ podcast, you can get 10% off Go Sport products at gosport.com. So that's GEAU sport.com by using the discount code TennisIQ10. So visit gosport.com and be sure to check out their selection of premium gear bags for tennis and pickleball. Josh and I both use their bags, and they are fantastic. Again, you can use the discount code TennisIQ10 to get 10% off all products at gosport.com, GEAU sport.com. So Josh, how about your initial thoughts on the article, and maybe just the topic of how we might lose skill or competitive level depending on these different factors, which we will explain as we go along.
Yeah, I think it's a situation that I would say everybody goes through if they play long enough. And what I liked about the article is just kind of the way that they broke it down into these different factors, right? Into that the essentialist, environmentalist, and existentialist, different accounts of talent, sort of how talent is talent or ability is lost or changes over time. I know you mentioned how even the word itself can be viewed a little bit differently, and they talk about this in the article. They talk about how in Scandinavia and in German-speaking countries, talent refers to potential, right? So they talk about, kids who have talent as essentially having potential for more growth. And then in, Anglo-American context, it tends to describe athletes that are currently performing at a certain level. And I think that's an interesting piece to this, where, when they refer to talent in this article, it's more, I would say that sort of American context of
Or UK
um,
more. I feel like it's
or
more
UK
UK.
exactly of
Yeah.
sort of where somebody's ability is at the moment. It's not necessarily referring to that potential piece, but no, I think when we start to think about the article and later we'll get into particular recommendations and how people can sort of navigate this process. um, yeah, I think it is interesting to sort of think about the different avenues where this can take place, right? There's the more physical side, right? Where as somebody gets older, um, their physical abilities can, either deteriorate or just be more challenging to sort of uphold. There is the environmental piece where it's sort of based on circumstance and situation, that can, I guess, change what somebody's playing conditions are and opportunities are and things like that. Maybe it's somebody that goes from high school to college, or maybe it's somebody who's navigating the professional ranks and, that their environment changes over time. And then there's that last piece, which I know we can dive into maybe a little bit deeper, the existentialist piece, where they, essentially conceptualize talent not as something just that you have, but as who you are, and talk about a little bit more about the identity and the identity loss that can take place within people, as people maybe um, stop playing their sport, or get older and no longer play at the same level, and how that impacts that identity piece and how somebody views who they are. So I think it's a really interesting article, and we will certainly link to it so that people can read it. That'll be in the show notes. And yeah, I think there's a lot to say here in terms of how people can navigate this process, not just in terms of sort of that loss and maybe retirement from the sport, or aging in the sport, but as you navigate your tennis journey, there's an inevitable change, right? From age group to age group in juniors, from age group to age group in adult, league tennis and tournament tennis, in the professional ranks, and in college year by year. So there's an inevitable progression, and I think factors change. Physically, things change. Your environment will change. Sort of how you view tennis in relation to your life will change. So I think it's a matter of, okay, how can we best smoothly navigate this process?
So let's go through each view in a little bit
Yep.
more detail and maybe provide some examples. So the essentialist view is really more about physical and cognitive deterioration over time. And I think that's probably something that we're very accustomed to associating with like top level athletes. We've seen this with, Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Serena Williams, sort of anybody who kind of hangs around long enough that we begin to see that decline. And I think we're currently seeing it with Novak Djokovic, who, yes, he can still compete as maybe the number 3 or 4 player in the world, but has almost admitted that he can't beat the top 2 guys, right? That there's something, just a little bit beyond him at this point. And so that is one I think we can all really identify with, and will most likely happen to all of us at some point. And what goes on there, I think, in terms of the feeling, right? The word used throughout the article with all of this sort of drop in level or ability to compete is it's a sort of disorienting feeling. And, I think at this sort of essentialist piece, right, we begin to maybe doubt our abilities. Maybe we now have a lack of trust in our ability to compete. And I think I saw this a little bit at Roland Garros when Djokovic played Sinner. I think that was the semifinal, right? And we've talked about on certain episodes this idea of the Djokovic rules, like these rules of directionals. And when he follows those, like he makes himself tough to beat, and he sort of goes into like a lockdown mode. And he was breaking those rules all over the place in that match. Which means I think he really doubted, whether he knew this or not, really doubted that he could stick to his game and win. He felt the need to do more. And often that need to do more is a trap for players. And it ends up usually leading to more mistakes. So I think it has a disorienting feeling. It can lead to a disruption of perhaps our identity in the present moment. I think a lot of the existential view is not just about who you are, but it's who you are becoming, right? That potentiality piece. Do you have any other examples you think of, Josh, for the essentialist view, this idea that players will experience a physical and maybe some cognitive decline, not dementia, obviously, but more like maybe an ability to not focus as well, or maybe we don't control our emotions as well as we used to. You have any other examples, you think?
I think I think that there's different examples that come to mind. I think before we started recording, I know you brought up Nadal, and sort of towards the end of his career. And yes, he battled a number of injuries throughout his career, but especially towards the end when it was clear that he was sort of playing his final season. Yeah, I think there were definitely some moments where we saw him maybe not always handle emotions in the same way that we were accustomed to, right? And that's not to say that he was, breaking racket after racket or anything like that, but I think, for somebody who was known as
Yeah, like based on his standard, it was
exactly,
different, right?
exactly.
For somebody else, that would be brilliant behavior.
Exactly. Yeah, somebody known for really showing very little, if any, outward negative emotion and frustration. Was that there were moments where he was showing it more, and you know, to be fair to him, there it must have been very frustrating, right? To be losing the players that he's used to beating, and operating at a lower level. So that's one example that comes to mind. I mean, I think about a number of players who have had to either end their career because of an injury, or just sort of seeing their abilities start to dwindle. I mean, you brought up Djokovic. I think about Djokovic and Serena as two obviously legends of the sport, two of the best of all time, certainly, who both sort of chased that final Grand Slam for a while, it felt. And I think this is a common experience where somebody is getting older. They realize that they have, less time at the top of the sport left, certainly. But they feel their body is, maybe deteriorating in certain ways. And, again, this is something that non top pro athletes experience as well, right? As they're playing in their sport, there's certain physical facts of life in terms of, aging going in one direction. So no, I think there are a number of different examples here, and yeah, as you said, Brian, it's not just the physical piece. It's cognitively, whether it's decision making or emotional control or even motivation, and we could talk more about the motivation piece, but that can, I think, certainly be a challenge. Especially somebody like a Serena or someone like a Djokovic who really has, accomplished so much in the sport, where that motivation can, I don't want to say it can fade, but it can certainly change over time, especially with both of them being married, having having a kid or multiple kids. It can, that motivation piece can certainly change over time as well.
For sure. And then I think, the one that we're all more likely to face at different stages of our careers, that social or environmental change. And you brought up a couple of examples, Josh. It could be about moving to another level. So high school to college. High school, maybe I am the best player in my state or best player in my school. Now I go to this different environment and I'm no longer that. I'm just one of many players there. That can certainly happen from college to pro. It could happen as, an adult player who's moving up from 3.5 to 4.0 or 4.0 to 4.5. And it's not that our skill level has dropped, but it's maybe our potential to compete is has changed, right? We're in a new audience now, and it's again, that's disorienting. And can I win at this level? You don't know. So that can be something that's difficult to deal with. I think then there can also be changes around the game in terms of maybe my generation was a little bit more affected by this, Josh, because I started off with wood rackets, but very metal rackets were there. I think I remember the first graphite rackets coming out in the early 80s, and that did change a lot of the way the game was played. Lighter rackets led to more semi and full Western grips than you would have seen before, right? So the nature of the game really changed in that time. I think you could even see like someone like John McEnroe, who, yes, he was at early in the graphite stage, and one of his best years was with a Dunlop graphite racket, but very quickly he had a great year in 1984, and that was kind of like it. Yvonne Lendl took over the game, Becker, Edberg, more powerful players. So even just that change, that technology change, not that John McEnroe ever lost talent, but his ability to compete in sort of the new rules, per se, kind of put in quotes, rules, was less. He was not built for that. If we had remained with wood rackets, I wonder how many Grand Slams John McEnroe could have won. Right? He was unbelievable with his ability to serve, volley, and the touch and so forth. But the differentiator eventually became guys were hitting through him more. Right. So I think, we all can kind of feel this kind of thing. And sometimes these changes in environment, the article doesn't get into this, but actually could make you better.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think, some of those guys in the 80s, their games got better because lighter rackets, more powerful materials. In the last 25 or 30 years, different types of strings, right? Poly strings have definitely helped players become better returners. So there are sometimes it actually enhances your ability to compete and perform. But the article here is more focused on that loss piece. So I think that this is interesting because more of us are probably likely to face this in the middle of our careers. Things are always changing socially, environmentally. Could be new coaches. Again, that can be plus or minus. That could be our talent could be really brought out by a great new coach. Or maybe we get into a coaching situation that's a little bit more negative. Or we go to a team and we don't really click with a coach, or we go to a new club and I'm playing on a adult team and they have assigned a pro, and I don't click with this pro. These things can affect us, and so I think what we'll get to is, all right, how do we handle some of these disorienting factors? What are your thoughts on the environmental social piece, Josh?
I think it's very very relevant, and they do mention actually Andy Murray in the article,
right?
Talking about how his environment helped him, right? How he playing with Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer. Yes, and he, maybe in certain ways he had fewer opportunities to win some of the big titles with those three, playing at the same time and tending to be ranked above him and winning more, major titles, but it made him a better player. So the environment in that case really helped him. And I think actually, Djokovic has talked about this, and I think Federer and Nadal to some extent as well, how they became better players by being in that environment of that constant competition and knowing that they had to be better in order to, in order to continue to win, they knew that they had to be better because of the competition level of their peers. So, but yeah, I think that there are a lot of on the other side of it, I think there are a lot of environmental changes that can be really really tough and sort of lead to that loss that's described in the article. Whether it's somebody going from high school to college, or you mentioned 3.5 to 4.0, 4.0 to 4.5, and I think those changes can really cause somebody to question a lot of things. I think it can, the on the other side of it, right? As a player gets older, they might get dropped from 4.5 to 4.0. They might get dropped from 3.5 to 3.0, right? Whatever the situation may be, right? So the circumstances can change, right? I mean, another factor is tennis playing opportunities, and particularly competitive tennis opportunities, are not equally divided in all places geographically, right? Maybe somebody moves, right? And there's more opportunities for competitive tennis, or less opportunities, fewer opportunities for competitive tennis, or more, or fewer opportunities for indoor tennis in certain parts of the country, which is obviously needed during the winter months in a lot of the countries. So I think a lot of these environmental factors are end up becoming really important. And even financially, right? Maybe somebody's in a financial place where they can afford lessons and clinics and playing on teams and traveling to tournaments, and then maybe that changes, right? They talked in the article about war being an environmental factor, where I know Djokovic has talked about his experiences as a kid during Serbia's wars, um and that's an environmental factor that impacted him. And again, everybody has different life circumstances that sort of shape their ability to compete and to work on things. Everyone has different upbringings and different family situations, and all of these circumstances really impact things. So I think it's important that the article, recognizes that and discusses that, because I think realistically, it is something that impacts everybody in different ways.
Absolutely. And then the last view is the existentialist view. We've often talked on this podcast about one of the reasons, or one of the more fulfilling reasons for playing tennis, is to try to become the best player that you can become. And it's possible at a certain point that potentiality starts to go down, right? Can you actually become better at a certain point? And we've also differentiated with the existential view that there are three versions of all of us. There's who you were, who you are, and who you are becoming. And it can maybe be difficult to reconcile that, hey, once I was great, but now I'm not so great, and I don't think I'm becoming greater. I might be going down, right? And I think we'll all reach that point where the potential to become even greater may dwindle. And it might be more of a maintenance and so forth. And so I think this is an interesting one, because we will all feel this at some point. Unless we just outright quit at a certain point. Like maybe, you could look at, say, a Bjorn Borg who quit very early. Yes, he did play some like senior tennis after that, but I don't know that he was pursuing becoming his best.
27, 25 or 26?
26, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, I think there's a new autobiography coming out very soon. Which actually he reveals he's got an aggressive form of prostate cancer. So he's dealing with that, and that's another factor for people to deal with. But this existential piece is just something that we might start to identify a lot with who we were. Right? Remember those days when I could do this? Remember those matches? And that's good. That can kind of fuel our love of tennis and why we do it, etc. But it can also be disorienting to realize that maybe the physical capabilities are no longer going to allow me to continue to improve and move my level up. And I also feel like this is a part where I am a little bit, at 57, almost 58 years old. It's going to be harder to like literally continue to get better. And at a certain point, maybe something has to change with how my relationship with tennis. But before we get into some of those things, let's get your thoughts on the existential view.
I think it's a really important view. I think it connects to a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in terms of, tennis being sort of the relationship to how, a lot of people sort of view their sport as who they are to a large extent, right? You know, I can think of my own experiences in this, but I think for a lot of people, when they are really passionate about a sport, when they devote a lot of time to it, when they play at a high level or relatively high level, it can start to feel more like this is who I am, or this is a big piece of who I am, rather than just this is what I do, or this is a hobby of mine, or this is something I enjoy. It's no, I am a tennis player. And I think in a lot of ways that's natural, but I think there's a certain danger there where, when things inevitably change, right? When people get older, when somebody's not playing professional tennis anymore, or maybe somebody's not playing college tennis anymore, or maybe not able to play for a certain club team or whatever. If we're viewing, a big part of our self identity based on that performance piece, it can be really easy for for us to to sort of fall into this place of that identity really shifting, or maybe us starting to feel that that this thing that has always been not just something that I do, but really who I am, is that identity really starting to shift over time. So I think this third piece is really important. I mean, they talk in this article. They even bring up Nietzsche, who talks about what was the quote? Everyone possesses inborn talent, but few possess the degree of inborn and acquired toughness, endurance, and energy actually to become a talent. That is to say, to become what he is, which means to discharge it in works and action. So he talks about sort of, the ability of, not just having sort of this potential, but, really making something out of that potential. And I think for a lot of people, myself included, where tennis is a passion, it's easy to, as you see tennis, as you see over time, you really work towards something, you achieve certain things, you accomplish certain things, and there's a certain pride there, right? But maybe it's okay, I'm proud that I played in college, or I'm proud that I was all conference, or I'm proud of certain sectional rankings or national rankings or international rankings or whatever that may be. When that inevitably changes over time, or your abilities change over time, it can lead to that real loss of not just the sport or the physical piece, but on a little bit of a deeper level, more of an existential level, that feeling of loss of of a piece of actually who you are, which can be really tough. And I know, Brian, you talked about just different changes over time, right? And it getting harder to continue to improve, or maybe continue to find different pathways of improvement and getting to the next level and things like that. So I think there's a lot that we can talk about with this third piece, and it's it's something on my mind as well, certainly. But yeah, trying to find new avenues of improvement, and maybe even a new relationship to the sport in certain ways. And we see this with certain pro athletes, where after their career they become coaches, or they become commentators or media personalities in some way. So I think there's a lot that we can talk about here in terms of what athletes can do during this stage in order to maybe stay connected to their sport or find some sort of new productive relationship to that sport that they've loved for so long.
We've discussed identity, performance identity in the past, and the dangers of it, and put out the view that perhaps we should, excuse me, develop more of a purpose-based identity, which I think is goes along with the existential view that this is all about um, why we do something, and that we're always working towards some sort of potentiality. Um, but in the situation that we're discussing, the potentiality for improvement isn't as obvious, and yeah, maybe it's time to change the purpose. And therefore, we've often called this a project, the tennis project, your tennis project. The mission of the project, the purpose of the project may have to evolve. And you brought up a couple ways that we can do that. We could go into coaching as a way to continue our tennis project. Doesn't mean we don't play anymore, but maybe the playing is more about staying active, staying healthy, staying connected to the tennis community, and becomes a little bit less about having to win or accomplishments or rankings or ratings or so forth, right? And can we be comfortable with that transition? Can we give tennis a new purpose for our future, our potentiality? So coaching is one way. You mentioned, maybe even doing media gigs. A lot of pro players have gotten into podcasting and media. Some even during their careers are doing a little bit of both. There's obviously mentorship that you could do. There's philanthropy that you could get involved, right? So there are a lot of avenues for anyone really to channel their tennis project into something else while still maybe remaining a player, such that can we be comfortable with the fact that I'm not as competitive, perhaps, as I used to be. As you get older, it becomes harder to play with younger players. They're in better shape. They hit the ball harder. It's almost a different game, right? If I were to play with a college kid from today, and even if I was somehow to be the college kid I was in the mid '80s, I would get destroyed by today's player just because they're in better shape, they're stronger, they hit the ball harder. So I certainly can't be competing in 18 plus leagues, in the USTA as well as I could have. And so we all have to reconcile that that's who we are at this point. We can still connect with who we were to know that, hey, I can do things, but let's channel that energy and that confidence of my ability to achieve things into whatever the new purpose of the project is. Whatever I've learned on the project up until this point in terms of my character and what I can be better at, what I need to continue to work on, what I'm good at, I can channel that all into new purposeful projects. And I think this also holds, I think the essentialist view around physical and cognitive decline and level goes well with this, right? These two things really do interact. I think at the social environmental level, that's a little bit different, although you can still feel identity changes there from an existential piece, right? Like when you go to a new level, you might feel like, oh, I used to be so good before. I'm not feeling that right now. Do I actually have the potential to get better here? Do I have the potential to compete at this level, right? So you can always still see the who you were, who you are, and who you're becoming piece as part of each of these frameworks. But I'm thinking, just because I'm going through a little bit of this, Josh, is how do I begin to evolve the purpose of my tennis project such that I'm continuing to play, like I'm not getting discouraged about playing. Because quite frankly, I'm not winning as many matches, but I'm not playing as much, right? So you have to kind of accept that reality. And so I think this is something we can all maybe prepare ourselves for a little bit. You mentioned before we got on air, Chris Eubanks, current player, but also doing commentary. So could we even do some of these next level parts of our project earlier just to get that going so that the transition feels more natural at some point? Maybe it's even something you want to put more time into because you really enjoy it. Chris Eubanks is really good at tennis commentary. Be great to hear more from him, even as he's playing. So, what are some things you think, Josh, that players can do to help them through kind of that disorientation of these different factors that may lead them to not feel like they're as competitive as they used to be, or that they even can compete anymore at a particular level, or whatever that transition might be?
Yeah, I think Chris Eubanks is a great example of somebody who is aware of the fact that they're not going to play professional tennis forever. And, life continues after that. And, some pro athletes choose to retire and not, maybe work as much or not be as involved in the sport after that point, but a lot of them do. So I think being able to set yourself up for that transition ahead of time, right? By developing that skill and experience as a commentator, for example, like what he's doing. What you see with a lot of other athletes is they maybe start a foundation and they start that during their playing days. Federer, for example, with education in developing countries. I know a number of countries in Africa, for example, has done really great work and started that during his playing career. A number of other top players have started foundations and have done really incredible work that way. And I think what that does is it helps give them purpose, right? So it's not just about winning and losing. It's about, okay, I can sort of use this platform that I've built through this sport to impact other people, to continue to make a difference, and also to give me meaning in this new chapter. So that's what certain pro athletes have done. Again, with adults or maybe amateur players, maybe that starts to look different. I know certain people who aren't necessary, like who decided to go into coaching in some realm, right? Maybe coaching wasn't their career during most of their adult life, right? Maybe they were in whatever sort of other career, but they decided, I want to do some high school coaching, or I want to coach some kids, in the local community, and have found ways to sort of give back or find purpose through the sport, and through their expertise and experience in the sport. Doesn't mean they need to be a world ranked, professional player, but using their background, using their experience to coach, which I think is fantastic. So I think there's a lot of avenues, right? I think about this avenue, in terms of the podcasts, right? Where obviously Brian and I, do our work, with individual athletes and teams sometimes. And we reach, the people that we work with directly. But I think about this podcast as a great way to, to reach quite a few more people. And, with these ideas, with these concepts and tools and whatnot. And yeah, I think, if people are willing to look outside the box and be creative, there are ways to impact others through your experience, right? And that might not just mean, okay, I'm lacing up my tennis shoes and I'm heading out there for another match and I'm competing for a certain ranking or a certain tournament or whatever it may be. There might be ways outside of that. And again, that doesn't, I can speak for myself personally, who, I continue to try to work on my game and compete and whatnot. But and that's something important to me. But I also, I think that view has shifted over time, where it's not necessarily just about me and my own personal career and, ability level. I think there's, an opportunity there to impact others and to help others. And I think a lot of people who are navigating this find that, right? And they find that in different ways, whether it's through media, whether it's through coaching, whether it's through the foundation piece. But I think, finding ways to impact others can be a great avenue towards encountering that, what this article refers to as talent loss, or just, that inevitable process that people go through. And I think especially it helps with that third piece because it brings that meaning.
Yeah, and I think that if we can keep purpose and meaning around our tennis more central and less about maybe talent and competitive level, those things are not fully within our control. But can we bring it back down to more controllable things that are purposeful for us? I think another thing, Josh, that we could suggest is more on the volunteering side. Could you work, for whatever your local tennis organization is? So if you live in the United States, there's definitely going to be some sort of USTA section, and a lot of the USTA sections are even broken up into smaller districts. So there might be, like here in New England, there's Eastern Massachusetts, there's Western Massachusetts, there's Connecticut, Rhode Island, there's the northern states. They all have, their little districts, and you can be volunteering there, making an impact. That could be part of it. But I think as long as we're healthy and able, we should want to get out on the court. It just might be that the reason we do so is less about rankings and ratings and more about community and being active and healthy. Obviously, tennis is one of the best sports one can play in terms of health and especially heart health.
It was written on the I think Arthur Ashe U.S. Open court, right? World's healthiest
Yeah,
sport.
right. And I think, in general, we see that. We see a lot of people who play tennis living longer, healthier lives. And that can certainly be a great purpose for why we do this sport. So I think this has been an interesting topic, Josh. And I think it's something that since we're all going to face it, we should all have some consideration of how we want to handle that in the future. So I wanted to just thank you for having this conversation, because it is more philosophical than in maybe on the psychology side of things, but I think it works its way in to that. And I think, the thing that we're always trying to do is how do we put some practical implications around these views such that we and everybody who's listening can actually take some action to try to improve their own circumstances, to try to improve their own game. So that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes, and we will link to the article that we discussed today. If you have any feedback or questions for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. And you can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.